di leen gaaw fii ci C3S moo mën ci daggalu verre simple verre feuilleté ak finition bu set te mucc ayib jaaxle jeex na lépp luy décoration ci bépp xeetu verre C3S moo ci mën soo leen bëggee bënn lu verre ci diamètre bu munti doon suñuy machine moo ci gaaw soo leen di monter ay balcon rampe baie vitrée wala façade verre suñu machine polissage bu bees bi dina la jox finition bu set wecc machine biseautage bi ngeen bëggoon am na léegi verre bu munti doon dinañ ko liggéey ba mu mucc ayib fàttewuñu sablage bi ak modèle yu taaru ci noo leen ko bëggee C3S indil na leen itam ay xeetu assemblage double vitrage ak isolation phonique thermique yu leen di indil noflaay ak dal ci seen bërëbu liggéeyukaay wala dëkkuwaay C3S am na ca Ziarras Soprim Pikine Kër Massar Thiès Touba Louga Saint-Louis Kaolack Ziguinchor Ourossogui Tambacounda woote leen ci 33 859 70 70 wala ci 33 859 70 71 wala ci internet www.c3s.sn.
إلى ولي المؤمنين وشكور وجهت كل بحمد وشكور إلى ولي المؤمنين وشكور قل يا ولي يا قدير يا نزير للمؤمنين إنك ناد بشير عزبت فورا لسوانا كل من ليس يكون مؤمنا يا زمن عزبت فورا لسوانا كل من ليس يكون مسلما يا زمن عزبت فورا لسوانا كل من ليس يكون محسنا يا زمن
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم ربي اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. Dear viewers, thank you so much once more for being faithful to your show Focus with Sokhna Binta. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and we are very happy to meet you every Saturday at 7 p.m. as we always do, in order to continue the conversation we've started, trying to retrace our steps, the steps of Islam, the steps of our Black legacy, the step of our ancestors, the steps of our forefathers, so that we can understand who we truly are and what role we should play being here in the United States, not only from a Black perspective, but also from a Muslim perspective, and ultimately from a Murid perspective. We've also started by sharing with you the history behind the discovery of America, who was here prior to Christopher Columbus, how did the slaves live in the United States of America, in America when they arrived? Were they Muslim? We found that yes, they were Muslims with the slavery, and those Muslims were the one that worked in the plantation fields. Those are the Muslims that worked in the White House. Those are the Muslims that also worked in building America, as it was said that 30% of the slave trades were Muslim, as it is believed. We also moved a little bit further. We discussed about the attempts of slaves to free themselves through rebellion, but also we've seen slaves such like Ayub Suleiman, who took the high road and tried to free themselves through negotiation, but also through behavior. The way that he behaved himself allowed his masters to see that he was a dignified man, and hence he was freed. We also faced other realities as we visited the history of America, as we saw how the debate of slavery and the debate of freeing the slaves were getting louder and louder. And as the masters are now paying attention and entertaining the idea of freeing the slaves. But before that, we also discussed about how the union formed. What kind of role did the Muslims play as America was expanding through the states? We've heard about Hajj Ali in Texas, who many believes that he was a white, a Caucasian, one of the Caucasian forefathers. But as we've seen in the previous episodes, we've noticed that Hajj Ali, indeed, his real name was Haji Ali. And as he came from the Arab world, he was brought here in order to dress and look after the camel poor. Those are just few examples to show you that American life is deeply embedded within the Islamic legacy that our forefathers also brought into the land. As we move forward, we've seen that America now got to a place where they needed to organize. The states were more expanding. And as they created the union, states wanted to join the union a little bit further. And as they wanted to join the union a little bit further, there we had a discord. We had a disagreement in what phase America should take. One of the phases was, should we keep slavery going? As the Northerners said, should we expand? Should we free the slaves? Both had valid reason. As the South needed the slave to be kept enslaved, because most of the plantations there was needed. They needed the slaves to be in those plantations in order for the activities to keep going. However, the North, who was already expanding through the Industrial Revolution, didn't really need the slaves. This discourse led us to our episode of today, where we have to discuss now what happened when the North and the South disagreed. As I have it always, today I am joined by my guest, my amazing guest, Mr. Jibijai, who has been with us all along, explaining to us and joining into the conversation so that we can understand more of America. Again, this is Focus with Sokhna Bineta. As you can follow us on Facebook, on Twitter, with Periscope. Anywhere where you have a smart device, you can go ahead and follow us. Mostly, please join our YouTube page, like and subscribe it so that you can have a notification whenever we are on air. Thank you so much for following us, and thank you for watching Focus with Sokhna Bineta as we engage into a new conversation. Mr. Gibi, how are you today?
Assalamu alaikum, Sokhna Bineta. Alhamdulillah, I'm doing fine. And I'm honored again to be your guest on the show, and I extend my greetings to Mr. Majamal, who's and all his crew, and I say hello also to all our listeners, viewers here in the United States and throughout the world.
Thank you so much. Thank you. It's always a pleasure to have you. And really, we've had 2 episodes that, we've been getting a lot of feedbacks on people reacting really on the work that we've been doing. I've had calls from Egypt, Mr. Jamal, who called me, and he's faithfully watching us from Egypt. That just shows you really how people are tuned in. This was content that was deeply needed for our community, for us to know the history of America from an Islamic American, African American point of view. So thank you so much for really being a major part of the work that we are doing here, Mr. Jan. So without further ado, I really want us to talk about where we left off last time. An America that is almost divided. Why were they divided? Because they were not understanding, really, they were not agreeing in what phase America should take. Mr. Jimmy, what's your take on when they had to decide between the rules and the requirements that is necessary for the West to join now the Union?
Thank you. That's a very important question because it lays the foundation of which path the United States, the Union, we would say, that would later become the United States, which path the Union would take. And as you know, as you will see, and on west of the Mississippi River, there were those, that was empty land that Americans, like, it was the frontier where that needed to be conquered and occupied, and where like northern states were seeking to expand, and new arrivals of land seekers, of homesteaders. People wanted to move further west, but there was this debate, either that frontier should be like southern states that were inclined to pursue the slavery, expanding further in those area, and for the northerners, it was out of the question. Following all the political debate that that was brewing, and then that we have seen that some states categorically refused what the northerners were proposing, and as we will see later, the South Carolina was the first state to break rank, and and walk out of the Union, and which led to more political imbroglio between Northerners and Southerners, which ultimately led to the Civil War.
Well, thank you so much for that beautiful reminder of really the summary of how we got to where we're at now. And Mr. Jan, it is, as America was faced with those challenges, I wonder what was the state of mind and what was the situation of the enslaved Africans that was here. I understand that at that time we've had a lot of slaves who were trying to escape the South and trying to reach those states that were a little bit more lenient when it comes to slavery, or where they will be free. Now my thoughts are, my thoughts are really going towards the great movie of Harriet Tubman, who freed 250 slaves, and to see all the miles she had to go back and forth to try to free them really show us the length of the efforts that was taken by the slaves in order to run from one state to another. So the disagreement really was advantageous to certain slaves.
Yeah, of course you can say that, because the Civil War, and what led to it was a pivotal moment in the history of America, of America, and especially of enslaved people. But you just mentioned that ideal of freedom that has inhabited the slaves ever since they stepped foot here, and which culminated with the railroad underground, with Harriet Tubman, the Underground Railroad, and other movement of support that for abolitionists, for the abolition of slavery. But all that culminated with the Civil War, because the Civil War was a turning point for those who were enslaved. But mind you, you got in the South by the time before the Civil War started, we had like former slaves who were free, but who invested into slavery, and who were slave owners, who had farms, who bought their freedom. Yes, and
like
it's also, many there were like hundreds.
Absolutely.
There were, by the Civil War, there were more than 400 former slaves who got their freedom, but who turned out to be later, who had who had self-interest personal interest into owning slaves and being plantation owners. So,
but I want to ask you there real quick, because you touched on a very, very important subject, which is part of American history, where now what's happening is we witnessed the slaves coming from Africa, and the slaves struggling to keep their identities, and the slaves being able to maintain their identity up to the Civil War. But the Civil War was determinant into them shifting, even prior to the Civil War, as you said, into them shifting in their mindset and now really mirroring some of the behavior of the master now, where you can see a slave now acting just as the master was doing. So what do you think was triggering that shift in mindset?
No, actually, there are many accounts and assessment of that behavior, like you said, because some would, argue that some owned slaves because they wanted to free them, because you will see a husband owing a wife, or a wife owing a husband, or a mother and a son owing a father, so on and so forth. There was so many complex relationship into that mindset that we have to dig really and research a lot in order to understand the mindset. But many have expressed self-interests. Those who express self-interest, meaning they wanted to enrich themselves through slavery, because that was the zeitgeist. Everybody, that was the business of the day. That was where people were investing. That was the most valuable investment anyone could do. So those who express self-interest, and even those who the African Americans you see in Indian reservations, they were part of it, because they were also the Indians who, when they were being moved from east to west in Oklahoma, they moved with slaves, hundreds of slaves. You see Indian chiefs moving with their slaves. They all expressed self-interest, and they wanted to, assimilate, and they wanted to be accepted. They wanted to be seen as, good citizens, not as second-class citizens, and there were all these aspects that should be incorporated when we're looking at that behavior of former slaves who turn out to be slave owners later. But
that's a very interesting fact.
Yes, but in parallel, all this was happening at the same time. The Underground Railroad, the people owing slaves, former slaves owing slaves, and women trying to uphold to the ideal of freedom and dignity. You remember Harriet Tubman? She was a woman, and women are rarely mentioned in the movement of freeing slaves. And remember how long that Underground Railroad movement, it went from South all the way to Canada. And they were not the only figures in that movement. They were also supported by abolitionists, white people, women and men. Yeah, a lot of them in those.
I'm sorry. I mean, you touched on such a valuable point, and I'm so glad that you mentioned that, because this is something that is very little discussed. And it's discussed very seldomly. But we definitely, as we go and we move forward to retracing our steps back, it is important for us to touch very accurately on all the facets of slavery. And a lot of people really do not mention the Blacks owning slaves. But also there is another issue, Mr. Dian, which is the slaves breeding that happens as well during that period, where now not only Blacks are owning other slaves, we also see where other freed Black slaves, former slaves, are now having breeding houses, where now people are giving birth to children, and those children are given up for slavery, which is really, really, really heartbreaking when we think about it now. But we have to go back into the realities of that time period. You know, what does it tell you at that time with the blacks as a community? What triggered the fact that we chose to keep the suppression and the slavery going? Because before, we have to understand that the whole idea behind slavery was the white being superior to the blacks. But now you have equally, racially equal, if we could say that, two people that are racially equal, one enslaving the other. What can you tell me about that before we watch our first video?
Yeah. Also, it is important to understand that slavery has been evolving. It's not just white superiority versus black superiority, because there are instances where that did not apply. But there are many instances where that has been applied. And
especially
you will see, yes, you will see all that black and white superiority ideology shift into the political sphere past the Civil War. Now, that ideology was reserved to the field, into the plantation, but now it's gonna become mainstream, and it's gonna shift into the political sphere arena, and it's gonna be where you will see all those battles, and the Civil War was one of them. But prior to that, has, like you said, the black people, after the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade by the American Constitution, it became imperative for slave owners and plantation owners to start marrying, to start breeding slaves, children, because you can't buy any more slaves. They're not being imported anymore. That's when they allowed, even that's starting at that moment, that they allowed slaves getting together and getting married and having families, children. Absolutely. And you will even see, you will even see slave owners, the most famous being George Washington and Thomas Jefferson also, having, fathering children with their slave women.
Absolutely. I thank you so much for that. This is such a very important topic. Hopefully we'll come back to it. But for the sake of time, I just want us to go and watch our first videos. And before we watch our first videos, you said something that is very important. The key golden word here is that self-interest that you said. Let's see how self-interest, the self-interest of the slaves, the self-interest of the North, the self-interest of the South is being put to play in our next videos.
All right.
What caused the American Civil War? That's a complicated question, and one that many people still argue and disagree about today. After the American Revolution, the regions of the new country grew, but in different ways. Although there were still lots of farms in the North, it became an increasingly industrial society where many people lived in cities with factories. Although there was some industry in the South, it remained mostly agricultural with fewer people, over a third of whom were enslaved. Northern states had gradually abolished or gotten rid of slavery, while it remained legal in the South. In the 1850s, the big question was what to do about all the land in the West when it was settled and carved up into new states. Northerners wanted territories in the West admitted as free states, while Southerners wanted them to become slave states. In 1854, a new political party called the Republicans didn't want slavery in the Western territories. In 1860, their candidate, Abraham Lincoln, was elected President of the United States. Many white Southerners were upset by Lincoln's election because they believed they had the right to take their slaves to the West if they moved there. They also feared that as the number of free states grew, Congress would vote to abolish slavery altogether. Some Southerners began to claim their states had the right to secede or break away from the United States, which was also called the Union. They wanted to become a new country. That's exactly what happened in December 1860, when South Carolina became the first state to secede. 6 other Southern states followed, and in February 1861, they formed the Confederate States of America. At first, Virginia voted to remain in the Union. It wasn't until South Carolina attacked a Union fort off its coast called Fort Sumter that war actually began. Now, Virginia was forced to decide which side it would fight with, and after voting a second time, it chose to join the Confederacy. Even after secession, 50 counties in Western Virginia refused to leave the Union, and in 1863 became the state of West Virginia. How do you think a war in Virginia would affect your community?
There we have it. Great videos that's going to be serving us as a stepping stone so that we can really understand what happened with the Civil War. As we said, South Carolina decided to leave the Union, and the Union was broken. However, there was a key element there, which was Virginia, who chose to join the Confederacy. Mr. Jan, what are your thoughts when you see that now we are seeing an America that is divided, and how this division is playing in the favor of the slaves?
So what we can say, that has been said over and over again, debated over and over again, is the interest Northerners had against the interest Southerners have, which was all about when we have to move to west, further west, to occupy those lands, we have to move with our slaves. And the Northerners the Northern states said, no, this institution of slavery needs to end. And maybe you can, find other ways and other means and other resources to continue. You can embrace industrialization and mechanize your farms and use mechanic replace it with labor and so on and so forth. So they went through all these debates, but ultimately, there would always be a spark that would, that will set fire to situations like this. And it was not late to come. It wasn't late to come. South Carolina, broke from the Union and then attacked Fort Sumter later, to occupy it, or to the real reason behind it until now, is not very well explained. But when they took Fort Sumter, that's when, the Union felt resentment about the Southerners and their concerns about maintaining the institution of slavery. And that's how everything started. But Virginia itself, as you see, which was also a bastion of slavery, Virginia was the first colony, the first British colony in the United States. Virginia was also the first place where the first slave ship landed. Virginia was also the first place, where some of the forefathers were from. You know, Virginia also was the place where plantation owners for hundreds of years, so on and so forth, pursue, or they should pursue, go with the South or stay in the Union, which brought, you know, that split. Yes.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Mr. Jan. I know that you know, there's so much information. It's so hard for us to try to grasp it with such little time. But you know, sitting with someone as knowledgeable as you are, you know, I think we are just taking like a drop in the bucket. But before we go, I really wanted to take the opportunity to bring something else to your attention and hopefully get your insight from that. Was the reason only self-interest? Because I do feel like there is something else more than that. Were the North only wanting to abolish slavery just because they were industrialized? I think there is more to that. There are also they were sympathizing with the blacks. There was also, like you said, people who formed families with the slaves. So what else can we say can be a cause of the Civil War besides just industrialization and just the South wanting to keep the slaves as for plantations?
Yeah, you can say that the northern states, they had like formally abolished slavery, and that was the bastion of abolitionists and runaway slaves. And it was the northern states also where the Underground Railroad, you know, passed by. Anybody who ran from the south to the north, you were saved, because you had all the way to Maryland, a plantation of slaves who were part of the legal institution of slavery prior in antebellum America. So, but northerners in northern states, beside the industrialization, it was a brewing country. It was brewing with ideas and noble ideas of freedom, idea of humanity, and you got many intellectual activities going on, a lot of societies that wanted to expand even beyond the United States, who wanted to go to Africa. To mind you, it was in antebellum in the second half of the 19th, in the first half of the 19th centuries, that states like that country that the United States bought land, like Liberia and Sierra Leone, and they wanted to go. You had like evangelical societies behind who wanted to go to evangelize people in Africa, because they were accumulating information and knowledge from slaves, you know, in the slave narratives and so on and so forth. So they wanted to expand the word of God out of the United States. So all those,
you mentioned the word of God. I'm trying to catch you on a very key points that you are mentioning, so that we are able to make a pause, because you are giving me so much good information. It's good for us to try to understand that. You mentioned two things that caught my attention: evangelical movement, but also you mentioned also what do you call it? The word of God. Now, I think at this point it is very safe to say that there was a very different understanding between the Christians of the South and the Christians of the North. But also another key point that I really want us to discuss is also the relationship that the North had. They were more open to the world. They were more open into exchanging with people from England, where the South was more close as a rural area. And the South being called the Bible Belt, really the understanding of the book of God as it was perceived was different and had a key role to play with the Civil War. What can you tell me about that?
Yeah, but remember that if the South is called the Bible Belt, it hasn't been called the Bible Belt back then in antebellum America. It's been called the Bible Belt because of the revival that black churches has put forward into maintaining and opening their own churches. Many black communities who were like kept out of coming into the worshiping places of white people, they had to build their own communities. And then the first black church was built in Georgia, in the Savannah area. And mind you, you had like in the North also many black communities, churches, black people who were free to assemble and to worship and to build their own churches, build their own communities, build their own. You had freedmen towns all over for instance, in New York here, in Brooklyn, New York, you had them in Massachusetts, and in the South also you had few. And the most recent freedmen town that was destroyed, that was burned to the ground by white people, by white mobs, was the one in Greenwood, Oklahoma, the Black Wall Street. And all this was happening.
What role did the Bible play? What role did the Bible play in the Civil War?
Yeah, but the Bible also was used as a tool. It was weaponized because there were already a lot of black people knew how to read and understand what was said in the Bible, and that ideal of freedom was, they were like many of the abolitionists, they used the Bible to criticize slavery and slave owners. So it was very, very essential, because that was the only book that was available to as many black people who could read. Even if you couldn't read, somebody in the community who was able to read will read the Bible and interpret it for you. And they were like, as you see, there were many references of freedom, and that castigated also references of the Bible, verses of the Bible that rejected slavery and bondages of people throughout history. So that was a very important instrument, I would say, that the Bible was used. And in the North also the same. You had like evangelicals and American colonization societies, where that was constituted also of men of the church. You had reverends there. You had like people who were very religious and who were members of those associations and so on and so forth. And even one thing maybe that I have to mention here, Ayub Suleiman, before he left, when he caught the attention of the colonization society, American colonization society, and they found out that he was able to read and he understood the Bible. Did you know that he was even given time to give a sermon during one of those assemblies that the abolitionists had? He was given time to, all those were happening here, and that was especially very an idea. The ideal of freedom was already steeped into the discourse of many Northerners, whereas in the South they wanted to maintain that agricultural society and agricultural life. But the Bible has played a major role into shifting the discourse of slaves and into the discourse of politics and all that. So
thank you so much. I think I think it was important for us to be able to see the two different interpretations of the Bibles, both from the South but also from the Northerners as well. But let's just go ahead and keep the conversation going. Again, I just want to remind everyone that you are following us, Focus with Sokhna Binta, on Bichri TV every Saturday at 7 p.m. You can watch us, follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Periscope. Anytime you have a smartphone, a device from your computer, from your TV as well, you could see us on Roku. You are always welcome to come and sit with us on this beautiful journey we are taking, retracing the steps of Islam in America, but also the history of our ancestors of Black Americans here in America. So let's go to our next videos that will tell us more about how the Blacks now, we talked about the Civil War, the war is happening, the South has seceded, and now we have to see what, how did the war begin, and what was the key players, who were the key players into the American Civil War.
It all begins right here. This is where the American Civil War begins on April 12, 1861. This is a defining moment in American history. It's going to be the flashpoint of where the American Civil War begins, which really defines us as a nation today. Instead of being these separate states, we became more of a real United States, a more permanent union. The Federals were in a much more difficult position than the Confederates were. We have the 84 officers and men, plus there was a group of civilian employees from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, about 28 of them. There were approximately 7,000 Confederate soldiers in the Charleston Harbor area. 43 Confederate guns were directed at the fort and fired upon it during the course of the bombardment. A 10-inch mortar is going to be fired from Fort Johnson, located about 1.25 miles from where we are now. That 10-inch shell explodes directly over top of Fort Sumter, and that's a signal for every Confederate gun that bears on the fort to open fire, and the bombardment will begin and continue for 34 hours. Over 3,000 rounds of ammunition would be fired at the fort, creating significant damage. We know that at least 600 rounds of ammunition hit the exterior walls of this fort, but none will really penetrate the 5-foot thick brick walls. Solid cast iron cannonballs heated until they're red hot in furnaces, loaded in mortars, and fired and come up at a high angle over the walls of the fort. They come crashing down through the roofs of the barracks buildings and officers' quarters, set them on fire. It's the fires on the inside in the buildings that forces Fort Sumter's surrender. There were a few minor injuries. No one was actually killed on either side during the bombardment. The only recorded death is an officer's horse on Sullivan's Island who was hit by a stray cannonball. You have this render on the afternoon of April 13th, 1861, and the actual evacuation taking place about 4 o'clock on the afternoon of the 14th, and Federals move out and the Confederates move in. When this war is over with, approximately 620,000 American soldiers have lost their lives. If you take all the American soldiers who died of all causes in the American Revolution, War of 1812, Mexican War, the Indian Wars, Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II, and Korea, and add them all up, there's still more American soldiers who died in the Civil War than all those wars added together. Out of this war, we get the National Cemetery System, the Medal of Honor, Memorial Day. Also, slavery ends, and we get the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. So this is where all that begins that leads to all those things. It begins right here.
MashaAllah, MashaAllah, what a great piece. Fort Sumter, where it all began, when the Union attacked and South Carolina responded. It is said that 4,000 men were gathered, 33 hours of fire-ranging bombardment. Amazing, amazing piece. That just shows you really how involved people were into this war and what was at stake. Mr. Jan, what do you see? What are your thoughts when you hear 620,000 Americans dying in this war?
It's 800,000, he said. It's even more than that, maybe, because 800,000. It's a astounding number. As he mentioned, you put all the wars that the United States has been, starting from the Mexican War, the Indian War, the Revolution War, the American Revolution War, Vietnam, Korea, World War I, World War II, you put them all together. The American people who died in the Civil War outnumbered the American people who died in all those wars put together. So that shows you the size, the atomic, I would say the atomic effect size that the civil American Civil War had, and the impact it had in the lives of people, everybody included, because we will see that during the war and how it evolved, nothing of that magnitude has ever happened within the United States. Either you are a soldier or a general, you have never dealt before with anything in this magnitude. So, which was the reason why you will see that during the Civil War, so many new strategies would be developed by the generals and politicians. The American president back then, who would be Lincoln, and also all the Congress and the Congress members, and they will be sitting and trying to devise new strategies, like strategic planning and strategizing on how to just make sure that the southern states would come to embrace that ideal of society, that where people would be equal and will be working together, and then nobody would be into bondage.
And that just made the situation work, I think, when they tried to strategize, because as the North was trying to bring new strategies, one of the strategies they took was from the French, and it was shown that that didn't work. Could it be a reason why we really saw so much bloodshed into the Civil War, when the South had a different strategy, but the North wanted to try something new?
You can say that, but also you have to understand that even the best general, you had the best idea that you have never put forward or applied. What makes you think that it's gonna work? Because it came from so and so. It is true that after the French, they were here helping Americans, the Union. They were helping the Union. It's not about the North or the South. The French were here since prior to the American Revolution, because they had a bone to prick with the British. They've been on and off wars with British people, and the American people were able to convince them that they need to come and help them win the war here, even though there were no revolution yet in France. Remember, the French Revolution happened in 1789, and the American Revolution in 1776. And the Americans were fighting the same ideal that the French kingship were afraid would happen to it one day, which will eventually happen years later. But the American Civil War was a ground where new military strategies and new military, even you will see new West Point graduates would come and join as commanders, and put their new what they've learned into practice. Some of the commanders in the Civil War were fresh graduates of West Point. So
now let me ask you there, Mr. Glenn. As you talk about people now joining the war, we see that we have different actors. You mentioned friends. You mentioned people new graduate from West Point. Is there any possibilities? What was the role of the blacks at this time with the Civil War?
so like we mentioned in the beginning of the show, black people who had self-interest into into slavery and being plantation owners. So those, they joined immediately without thinking. They joined the Confederates, and they were fighting on their ranks, and they were already proposing black people their freedom if they fight in their ranks. But with regards to the Union, they have to wait later in 1862, because there was some, like you see, Fort Sumter was taken by surprise by Southerners, and there were some battles where the Southerners they won Northerners in certain battles. But the Abraham Lincoln was already drafting the Emancipation Amendment, but he had to wait until a major battle that the North won to send So but some slaves were already running into the troops of the North, but there have not been any major political declaration that would call them to take arms in the ranks of the North until that Declaration of Independence was drafted. And then Abraham Lincoln asked, black people to join the Union and give them weapons, because back then there was no black people was allowed to even carry a weapon. But that would change during the Civil War.
What would be so attractive for the blacks to come and fight? I know that ending slavery would be one of them. You also mentioned that some of the slaves were also promised to be free when they joined the fight. Can you tell me more about that promise of them being free? Was it just one slave being free? Was it them being free with their families? How did that talk happen?
Anyone who joined with your family also, you will be freed. You, your children, your family, your wife, if you're married or anything. That was the deal. And many before even the North declared, open its troops to the slaves, the South already started recruiting, black folks, slaves who were enslaved. Yeah, that's what happened. So, but later you will see that most of them, they joined the North, and even people who were already free. Like you will see regiments from New York, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, where people were not in slavery, but they were working in plantations. Yeah, they joined because they wanted rights. Their rights to be, they wanted more rights, and they wanted also, states to take upon that question of rights and equality and push it further. Unlike in the South, where people was even starting to have a glimpse of hope after the Civil War ended, and that if the South were the victors, they will grant them their freedom with their families.
So thank you so much. We've definitely seen a great point, which is now we see the interest of the blacks and the enslaved. One of the interests was for the freed slaved. The interest was even bigger because they wanted the end of slavery, not for themselves, but for all Africans who were enslaved. They wanted equal treatment. They wanted fairness. And that was a major incentive for them to join the fight. For those whites of the North, they wanted also fairness. Others are more into their political belief, but also their religious belief, using the Bible as a valid reason for them not to enslave someone else or another human being. But also we've seen the French actors here, where they came in support of the Union. We also see the enslaved slaves. And those enslaved slaves also had a reason to fight, which is for freedom. It is interesting to see that both the freed slaves and the enslaved slaves were fighting each other for the same reason, which was freedom. Before we end the show today, I just want to show you our last videos that has to give us a little taste of how the Blacks joined the Civil War.
When the Civil War began in April of 1861, it was not legal for men of African descent to join the Federal Army. African Americans were serving in the Federal Navy, but they could not join the Federal Army. It was not until July 17, 1862, when Congress passed and President Lincoln signed into law the Militia Act, that African Americans were allowed to join the Federal Army. In 1862, regiments were organized in Kansas, South Carolina, and Louisiana. These regiments would be engaged in mostly small unit operations and engaged in combat in 1862. However, it was not until January 1, 1863, in the Emancipation Proclamation, that President Lincoln issued an order to his field commanders to receive men of African descent into all armed services of the United States. The Bureau of United States Colored Troops was established on May 22, 1863, with General Order 143. Active recruiting of African Americans began on a national scale in the South, in Union-occupied territories, and in the North. In the Western Theater, African Americans would fight in May of 1863 in the Battle of Port Hudson, the first major battle in which African American soldiers are engaged. In the Eastern Theater, African American soldiers would prove their mettle in the battle at Fort Wagner. The 54th Massachusetts would lead the assault, the failed Union assault on Fort Wagner. African American soldiers by the spring of 1864 would become a major part of those Union operations in Virginia. Under General Ulysses S. Grant, they would fight in the battles at Petersburg, and they would go on to earn distinction, with 15 Medals of Honor being earned in the Virginia Theater. And at Newmarket Heights, in September of 1864, they would capture the closest point captured to Richmond to that date. And they would go on as members of the 25th Army Corps, the only Army Corps in American history to capture Richmond, Virginia. African American soldiers would serve throughout the rest of the war, earning the respect of their generals. An Inspector General report that inspected a regiment out of Mississippi, the 3rd United States Colored Cavalry, reported that the superior status of that regiment was a reason why Negroes should serve in the active service. It was their service in the Civil War that leads to their enlistment in the regular army. In 1866, 6 regiments of African descent soldiers were established in the regular army, 4 infantry regiments and 2 cavalry regiments. When the army was downsized in 1869, 2 infantry regiments would remain and 2 cavalry regiments, and these soldiers would go on to earn fame as Buffalo Soldiers.
Beautiful, beautiful. What a beautiful video. We see it right there. 15 medals of honor won by Blacks from slavery to being honored for their action, fighting in line with those same people that enslaved them. What a beautiful story. Mr. Jan, what do you see now? I'm getting chills just to think about it, how far we've come from getting off the boat and being here and being held into slavery to now fighting alongside the masters, the previous masters, to earn freedom. What are your thoughts on this video we just watched?
Yes, very important questions. Questioning, our legacy and as a Black and as Africans here in the United States, from the early periods of the first slave ships got here And it shows you just that Black people have been at every turn, and corner in the history of the United States. So what has allowed the United States to enrich itself, to build wealth, and to become, very powerful, and anything that has been known as a might and power in this country was built on the backs of slaves, and this turning point in the history of the United States, you have seen them, but with the understanding of the political leadership that these people, they say, and they have something to bring into what is taking place right now, which is the Civil War. So once there was this legal declaration of them to be incorporated in all the United States Army, because as you see in the video, they were only serving in the Navy, but they can be incorporated through an act of Congress that was signed into law. They were incorporated, and they show what they could do, what they could bring, and they were recognized. So, and that would lead later to to more and more recognition and to more and more rights, because this was just the opening, because they were not given the same, because still, even though they were accepted into the army, they were segregated.
Absolutely.
They were segregated. They were not mingling with white people. They were not sleeping or eating with them. Yes. No, we are not there yet. We are not there yet. This is still Black people. Yes, it's still slavery. It's still Black people who are living at the bottom of society, most of them. But those who are called to join the union, even though they have more, the Northerners have more regards and more leniency than the Southerners, Blacks were still segregated. Blacks were still separated from their white counterparts. Even though you can see, even though you have more skills, you have more courage, more bravery than a white soldier, he's still on top of you. But their bravery and their sacrifices have been recognized. As you saw in the video, they were given medals of honors, they were given decorations, and what follows next would be also very important, and that it will be a very turning point into the lives of many Black people and many African communities, and later on for anyone else who coming from Africa. And we can extrapolate also that there has been in the Civil War over 1,500 soldiers who had like Muslim names. There were Mohammeds, there were like other names of Muslim, but we couldn't know if they were Muslim by their creed was Muslim, because back then, what actually the modern United States Army had, it wasn't like into existence, it wasn't into place, which was the dog tags. The dog tags that would identify every soldier with the faith, which one they belong to. That did not exist during the Civil War. So, but you see into enlistment rosters where you see Muslim names, popping up here and there, but there were no clear understanding even of how many Muslim enlisted into the army or volunteered, so on and so forth. But maybe later, throughout research and digging into the past of those soldiers and so on and so forth, we may get something into the future.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Mr. Jibijad. What a rich hour of information filled, videos and commentaries. So thank you. We are always so grateful to have you here. and for you to share your knowledge with us is something that is really priceless. We've seen it, viewers, where we had to really revisit the past, and to end so beautifully with the engagement and the enlistment of our fathers, our grandfathers, our ancestors here in the United States, really fighting for freedom, not freedom for their own, freedom for their families, freedom for those who came after them, but also fighting for justice, fighting for the justice that was fought by Omar ibn Said, this justice that was fought by all the other slaves that we've seen, from Mansa Musa all the way. It's just the legacy changing faces. The legacy of America was changing faces, but the narrative remains the same, which was freedom for all. And until next time, we will come back following our journey with Bichri TV every Saturday at 7 p.m. Thank you so much, Mr. Jan. Thank you, our viewers, for really staying and tuning in. Mr. Jan, definitely, I mean, we've got so many great feedbacks of the panels here. So on behalf of our team with Mr. Majama, on behalf of viewers, on another show with Focus with Sokhna Binta. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuhu.
حمدا لمن يفعل كل ما أراد بقوله كن فيكون في المراد سبحانه ربا لطيفا بخريب مسافر لم يره له الغريب من